Most teams at this point in the college football season, though it's still young, happy to be 2-0. Notre Dame, I'm thinking some are pleased with that. Others are taking exception. And of course, there's criticism from outside Notre Dame circles as well about the Irish's performance, not just once, but twice against two marginal opponents. So we'll find out what the deal is. We got Ben Belden on the line. We also have Nathan Erbach, so you can catch Nathan on our Notre Dame post-game shows. The one this week on the Notre Dame channel, also right here on the main channel at the Voice of College Football following the Purdue game. And Ben Belden's at Under the Dome podcast. Nathan's got his podcast as well that's fired up here in recent weeks. Golden Domers. Guys, how we doing tonight?
I'm doing all right, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see both of you and representing a Notre Dame football. So, Ben, we'll start with you. You were at the ball game against Toledo. I got to say I was a bit surprised. It was one of those under the radar games in regards to not just the opponent and people not expecting a great contest, even though the point spread was only 16 points. It wasn't some ridiculously massive point spread. But number two, of course, most people couldn't see the game. So there's that issue as well. But we may hit that topic a little bit later. But I think some people's attention was caught, mine included, with a score update with about 90 seconds left in the game that Toledo had a lead. So what did that performance look like?
I don't know that I have the words, to be honest with you. I mean, I said on my own show that it was just a weird game for a lot of reasons. Felt weird, I guess, not being at Notre Dame Stadium all last year and then kind of getting back when it was something that, I had done multiple times a year for however long was kind of weird. The stadium was kind of empty. There's obviously a variety of reasons for that. And it didn't really feel exactly perfectly right. There's mobile ticketing now, which if you know anything about Notre Dame's fan base, I think that played a little part into, I usually get into the stadium, from gate to seat within 5 minutes. It was like a half hour this time. I don't know. So I know I'm not talking about a bunch of football stuff yet, but there was that playing into it, all that ancillary stuff. And then I don't know. It felt like then, it settled after the first drive. Notre Dame went right down, scored pretty quickly, pretty easily. And then after that, it was just a whole lot of weird, here comes a freshman quarterback. Oh, wow, he looks really good. Then he doesn't come back out after he looks really good. It's like, is there a quarterback controversy or not? So really, I guess the theme is there's just so many questions about everything that, there's a lot of questions about everything. And then, they squeak by the skin of their teeth. And, and I think it's also bad that I might add that, they scored with, I think, just under a minute left, just over a minute left, somewhere around that. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, did they leave them too much time? So I don't know, just weird all around, I guess is kind of the way to put it.
Just to warn everyone, Nathan is not going to head up our offensive line segment that's going to last for an hour. So the offensive line, not mighty impressive in your view.
Yeah, no, I mean, we made the joke off camera that me and Ben could probably talk about an hour just on the offensive line. Probably true, to be completely honest. In my opinion, I think that's really the maybe it's definitely the biggest weakness on Notre Dame's roster after the first 2 weeks. In reality, it might be the only big weakness. I think there's some other issues that need to be resolved. The big plays, probably the safety position outside of Kyle Hamilton. And then obviously I think the dual quarterback situation as well. Eventually that's going to have to be, something you at least look into, whether you go Tyler Buckner full-time or Cone and the offensive line are able to figure it out enough to where you don't necessarily have to go to Buckner as much as you want to or need to, I should say. But yeah, no, the offensive line, I mean, they're down to their third string left tackle. Obviously no excuse when you're playing Florida State and Toledo in general, but third string left tackle. And then, on top of that, there's 4 new starters on the offensive line. So some growing pains were certainly expected over the first, probably first half of the season and maybe the entire season. But I don't think Notre Dame fans were necessarily expecting it to be as poor as it was over the first 2 weeks.
You guys have high offensive line standards to begin with, so understand that. Is it more pass blocking or run blocking or combination?
I think it's probably been a tad more run blocking, but it's both. I mean, especially when Cone's back there, I wouldn't call him a statue necessarily like some fans have been calling him, but when he's back there, he's not necessarily as mobile as someone like Tyler Buckner or Ian Book over the last couple seasons. And I think me and Ben would both say that Ian Book kind of made up for any sort of poor offensive line play at times, even though it wasn't, it was kind of far and few between, or few and far between. But this year, I mean, I think Ian Book would maybe have some issues with it. And I think if you put Buckner back there long enough, he'll probably have some issues with it as well. So no, it certainly has to be resolved for the offense to really reach its peak, which I think is actually pretty high if the offensive line's good.
Well, I'll ask this question, and then this conversation is probably going to work best if you guys just run wild with it. It sounds like I would guess that Jack Cohn was the toast of the town this time last week.
Yeah, I would say that Jack Cohn, in my opinion, played pretty well. I mean, he threw for Ian Book was throwing for something like 235 yards a game last season, and Jack Cohn came out against Florida State and beat that by 100+ yards, and completed 26 of 35. So that's 9 incompletions. 2 of them were drops to Notre Dame's best player. I mean, there were a couple throws, a couple times where he looked sloppy, but I think that was more, first game of the year type things as opposed to a long-term Jack Cohn problem. So yeah, I thought he played well. I was telling everybody would listen that I think Jack Cohn's going to be really good. And I don't necessarily think I was wrong. I just didn't think the offensive line was going to struggle like it has, kind of has, as Nathan referenced. I just thought that, I don't know. I thought that playing against Florida State, what we saw from the offensive line was an anomaly. And then against Toledo, it was going to be a nice confidence builder for him. And that wasn't the case. He gave up, I think, 6 sacks, ran for 3.4 per carry, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. So you expect better than that out of Notre Dame, but I don't know. So yeah, and it is interesting now that I was singing Jack Cohn's praises, and then Tyler Buckner gets his shot, and now I don't know what to think, to be honest with you.
I think with Jack Cohn, I mean, echoing a lot of what Ben said. I mean, obviously, I think I was a little bit lower on him coming out of game 1, specifically just in the first half. I thought he played really, really well in the second half and showed what he's capable of and what the offense is capable of overall. And he played terrific in that second half against Florida State, specifically, I think, in like the end of the second half, or end of the first half, into the third quarter. And then I wouldn't say he played poor on Saturday against Toledo. I don't think it helps when your offensive line is playing the way they are, because then you're going to start, looking down a little bit. You start getting a little bit more uncomfortable in the pocket, and just different things like that. So that's not necessarily, I mean, it's the quarterback's, it's the quarterback's job to trust the offensive line and make passes. And I think he did miss some, specifically yesterday. I mean, on Saturday. I mean, I know there was one, I think, when he threw the pick 6. There's some good replays out there that show a couple other guys were wide open and possibly even for touchdowns when he threw it. But I do think that has a little bit to do with just, maybe him getting a little jittery in the pocket because of the offensive line overall. And then on top of that, I mean, you see a guy like Buckner come in. He's had a lot of fanfare before he even signed with Notre Dame. I mean, he was a 5-star kid at one point, on pretty much every ranking service. Fell off a little bit when he didn't have a 2020 season, kind of came out with a different arm slot and just different things like that. Ended up, I think, finishing like in the top 100 still as a quarterback recruit, which is still obviously really good. And then he showed exactly what everybody wanted him to show, the mobility that he showed in high school, specifically during his junior season when he ran over 1,000 yards, showed off the arm strength that we all knew. off-platform throws. I mean, I think the touchdown to Chris Tyree, the 55-yard touchdown to him, really showed what he could do even when he's not necessarily set properly. Kind of did the Mahomes-esque with the sidearm delivery, and it was right on mark. So he kind of showed that upside that maybe a Cone or even an Ian Book didn't show at Notre Dame. And I think that got Notre Dame fans excited, and it probably got the coaching staff excited a little bit as well.
Yeah, to Nathan's point there, he referenced the pick six that he threw. There was no pressure on six, and Mayer was very clearly the first read. He looked at him the whole time. I was, my seat happened to be kind of right in front of this whole thing unfolding, and threw it right to two guys, and there it was. And like Nathan said, I believe it was Avery Davis in the slot kind of running down the middle, was just wide open. All he had to do was hold on to that ball and deliver it probably to his second read. So, there's a lot of Notre Dame fans that are, kind of myself included, that have sung Jack Cohn's praises and made excuses for him that he was under duress all day. But on his worst throw of the day, there was no pressure at all. So I don't know. I mean, no quarterback's perfect. I don't mean to insinuate that. But, the one thing I think that I would say to, make my point about this is that Jack Cohn relies on Michael Mayer a lot. And sometimes that kind of scares me because you got to get off the first read. I mean, it makes sense to have your best player be your first read. I get that. But, the other team knows that too. And so you got to get off that first read and make the plays. And in that case, he didn't. And it, nearly honestly cost Notre Dame the game, to be honest with you.
Well, if you expect Jack Cohn not to throw to the tight end, he needed to transfer to like Oklahoma or Ohio State. He came from a place where all you do is throw to the tight end. He goes to a place where you look for the tight end first. So I guess maybe it's just a habit.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly. And not to mention, he might be the best offensive weapon in the entire country. So it's certainly tough not to look his way, most of the time. And I think he has 16 catches for over 200 yards, 3 touchdowns already on the season, well on his way to break the Notre Dame tight end touchdown record, which is ironically only 6, which many guys have landed on over the years. And I think myself and Ben have probably predicted several Notre Dame tight ends to break that record over the last several seasons. When you look at, Cole Kmet and, Tommy Tremble last year, Michael Mayer even maybe last year, and obviously him this year again. So, but then you look at the guys like Tyler Eifert and Kyle Rudolph and Anthony Fasano, and none of them were able to do it either.
Yeah, I would have guessed a lot higher number than that. And I think most people would. So offensive line is a big issue. What's the optimistic projection that it's going to improve? Because I heard a lot of injury comments in there, which when you get injuries involved, these teams are only so deep, even if you've recruited at that level for Notre Dame, versus just it's not working right now. And you lost, 3 or 4 to the NFL from last season's 5.
Yeah, I think that the discouraging part, I guess, for me is that, sure, Notre Dame is replacing 4 offensive linemen, all of which I believe are on NFL rosters right now. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 of the guys that they're replacing with, the right tackle, Josh Lugg, has been at Notre Dame forever and has played. He's played meaningful football, filling in at different spots on the offensive line. The right guard is Kane Madden, who was an All-American that came over from Marshall, and those 2 guys, I mean, it's hard to pin overall offensive line play on 1 or 2 guys. However, those are 2 guys that I guess I, at the very least, would say I expected more out of, especially Lugg, who's been at Notre Dame and knows about Notre Dame and is familiar with what they're trying to do there. Didn't expect to worry really too much about Josh Lugg at right tackle. So that's the part, I guess, that gets me, is that sure that they're replacing a whole bunch of experience, but I mean, there was experience in some way, shape, or form, at least at 2 of those positions. Jarrett Patterson, the center, is the best center in the country. And then, we've had issues at left tackle and a little bit at left guard with, Zeke Correll, who, came to Notre Dame as a center, has been kind of, is he a center? Is he a guard? I don't know. I don't know. So that's the discouraging part. And the part after that is that then there's a lot of young guys. I mean, if you're going to scrap this offensive line, and I don't expect them to, but in theory, if they would, the guys that are behind them, Rocco Spindler, true freshman, Joe Alt, who would be about like their fourth or fifth tackle, true freshman. So it's pretty much these guys, and they've got to figure it out. Is really the point. I don't really expect a whole lot of personnel changes or shuffling around, and I guess we'll see if Nathan agrees on that part. But I don't know. I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah, and I think Kelly has pretty much said that there was some talk, maybe at least within the fan base and the media, that Patterson might move to left tackle, which was rumored in the offseason. Kelly pretty much shut that down. I mean, like you said, he's probably the best center or one of the best centers in the country. He probably overall hasn't been the issue. But when the four other guys aren't necessarily playing their best football, it's hard for one guy to stand out on the offensive line. I'd argue that Zeke Correll has been fine overall, specifically against Florida State. I thought he played pretty well. Toledo, not as much. And then I think Tosh Baker at left tackle got better as the game went on against Toledo. But when you had a true freshman left tackle starting the year in Blake Fisher, who I thought actually looked pretty well in his first, however many snaps he was able to play. Michael Carmody, kind of the same thing. I thought he actually played decent against Florida State as the game went on once he took over. And he was a high four-star guy, and Tosh Baker was a borderline top 100 guy. So these are guys that you're expecting to produce regardless of their age necessarily. And then, as you mentioned, obviously Josh Lugg, a fifth-year senior, has been there forever. My biggest concern with Lugg, I guess, coming into this season was when you're a Notre Dame recruit at offensive line and you're not getting your first taste until your fifth-year senior year, there's probably something there in regards to, not saying you're a bad player, but, maybe you're more, maybe you're just better as a rotational guy that, can start a game here and there. Lugg kind of reshaped his body as he was more of a guard, I think, his first couple years. And then now he's playing right tackle. I think he lost about, maybe upwards to 30, 40 pounds in the off season. So he's probably still kind of working on that a little bit and kind of getting his feet under himself per se with that body type. And then Kane Madden's looking more like an All-American that was MAC level All-American versus a Power 5 All-American. I think when it's all said and done, kind of the dump truck is sort of his nickname, and not necessarily the most mobile guy around, and he's starting to show that you can't really do a lot of pulling. He's not really involved in the screen game. The other guys have to be in order to kind of make that work. So, and I think he's showing his lack of mobility, at least at the Power 5 level, a little bit.
I got to say that I was surprised by his, not to cut you off there, Ben, I was surprised by King Madden's being named to the All-American team. Not that I've sat and scouted Marshall football game after game to look at Kane Madden. It's just that typically on All-America lists, they're obviously 90%, if not more, Power 5 players, number one. Number two, when somebody breaks through from the group of five, it's typically a stat compiler. It's a wide receiver or a running back that just had some like ridiculous stat sheet that they couldn't ignore. Some back runs for 1,900 yards and 25 touchdowns. And so he breaks into the first or second team All-America list from a group of five school. But an offensive lineman, I just was surprised by that, thinking, where are they getting this information? Who's doing this scouting to take an offensive lineman from Marshall and elevate him to All-America status? It just doesn't happen very often. And then in talking to you guys and talking to Brian Driscoll as well, he had said the same thing. I'm not expecting Kane Madden to be some exceptional, because I was like, oh, he's an All-American. He must be graded out to be extremely good. And he's going to Notre Dame, so that makes sense that he was going to be some kind of star. But I guess he's just another guy.
Yeah, what I was going to say a second ago is that Nathan made the comment that he's not the most, Kane Madden's not the most mobile guy in the world. And, I think that's I can't remember who I was listening to or reading that said this, but it was a really good point, that it seems like whenever Notre Dame does get a little bit going in the run game and have a positive play, which really hasn't been a real positive play, which really hasn't been too often. It seems like it's to the right where Madden and Lugg block and then you get Corral pulling and getting out in the space and that type of stuff. And that seems to be, when Notre Dame has handed the ball off, it always seems to be, going to the right side so that the more mobile guys are pulling around and all of that type of stuff. So, and as I think back, and my memory is usually pretty good in these things, I think that seems to be pretty true to me. So I don't know. And if I noticed it and somebody else noticed it, other teams notice it too. So that's also a little bit concerning. And then one last quick point that I'll make on the offensive line, because I don't think we actually want to talk about the offensive line for an hour, but is that I was reading the comments while Nathan was talking, and somebody asked about the front seven of Purdue. And I think, something worth mentioning that has me, I don't know, scared, is that Purdue has George Karlaftis, who's, probably the household name on the, at least on the defense of Purdue at defensive end. And given that we're not sure about Michael Carmody's health and maybe Tosh Baker is playing, maybe he's not, we're not really positive about that. That's something obviously to keep an eye on how Notre Dame manages, blocking him Saturday. So, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if that's a chip. I don't know if that's leaving a running back in, a tight end in. Obviously, if you're leaving a tight end in and you're using Michael Mayer, their best offensive weapon, to block, that's not what you want to do. It'll be interesting to see how Notre Dame does that. Maybe it's Tyler Buckner and you read option that guy a whole awful lot to keep him off balance. I don't know. There's answers, but it'll be interesting to see what those answers are.
Yeah, I mean, you could even maybe see a little bit more of the quick game. I mean, I think Notre Dame has the weapons on the outside to do that. And, obviously I think Notre Dame fans in the past have been somewhat upset with like wide receiver screens and just different things like that. But they've also been upset about not getting the running backs involved in the passing game, which they've done a lot this year. So I think you're going to see a lot of Chris Tyree and Williams involved in ways that aren't necessarily running the football. You're going to see Kevin Austin maybe on some screens, Braden Lenzy, Avery Davis on some screens. You might even see them involved in the running game where you can do like a reverse or like something of that sort where, to the opposite side of George Karlaftis. And I think the Purdue defense has some other weapons on it, but he's really the main guy you have to worry about. So I think the less you can put pressure specifically on that left side of the offensive line, to make plays, because I think that's probably where they're going to line them up the most. Then the better you're going to do on offense. And I think with having a full week of practice, something they haven't really had yet this year, I think Notre Dame will be ready to kind of do what they need to do against the one player on that defense you can't let beat you.
Yeah, Karlaftis is a 5-star at a school that doesn't sign 5 stars, and I believe he is the highest rated player that Purdue has ever signed. And he basically could see the stadium from his front porch. And one of the reasons why he's just a Purdue guy, always was going to go there, and he's that good, and he's fulfilling his potential. He's basically playing up to that rating based on what I see. I saw Purdue play a little bit against Oregon State in the second half. It was a low-scoring game that broke out to be more of a scoring fest just in the fourth quarter. They started to hit on some both on big plays between Oregon State and Purdue. Somebody had mentioned in the chat that Oregon State tore up Purdue in the passing game. I would say that was more of a fourth quarter thing. They started taking shots and going back and forth. They rang up 285 yards passing, no touchdowns. They did throw it 38 times against Purdue's defense. Jack Plummer, pretty experienced quarterback, won a quarterback battle with Aiden O'Connell. Those two guys have gone back and forth for a couple of years for Purdue, and depending on who's healthy and who's playing better, they've been wrestling the job back and forth with each other. But Plummer's the guy right now. 29 of 41 against Oregon State for 313, 2 touchdowns, no picks in 41 attempts against a pretty marginal defense, but a steel curtain defense compared to what Purdue faced last week with UConn. So I don't even know that we can check out those numbers to see because they really don't matter. Think UConn's working on like a 94-0 scoring deficit this year in 2 games.
Yeah, I think Notre Dame's a little bit of a step up in competition for Purdue so far. The one thing I'm really looking at is actually the opposite side of the football with Notre Dame with their defense. They've allowed some big plays this year, but in reality, I I know it's weird to say, you take away 4 or 5 plays, which were huge plays overall. You take four or 5 plays out of the picture, or maybe even just a few of those, and we're looking at a defense that has played pretty much rock solid all year round, and has covered up any weaknesses they do have, with some depth issues now at linebacker, now that they have 3 guys out for the season there. And then the secondary overall, I think at least was a perceived weakness coming into the season, but has actually, I think, played pretty well overall outside of that second safety position. And I think the Purdue offensive line is probably their weak link. Even Xander Horvath, who's not going to be playing this week, didn't have huge running lanes, but he was considered a tough runner, and most of his stuff was kind of breaking tackles. And I think he could have been one of those guys that was just sort of a pain in the ass for Notre Dame, I guess, because of that. But with him out and the Notre Dame front seven as good as it is overall, specifically just the defensive line, I think they're going to give the Purdue running game fits. They're going to make Jack Plummer maybe regret sticking in the pocket a few times, kind of like what they did against Florida State. And I think that's going to probably end up being the difference in the game overall, is you're going to force Purdue to have to throw 40, 50 times, maybe even more. And that's not necessarily a recipe for success when you're playing a team like Notre Dame.
Yeah, and I think to kind of continue that thought real quick is that if there's anything I'm encouraged about with the defense is Brian Kelly's comments about, we need to simplify, and instead of trying to pick and choose, we're doing this to highlight this guy, we're doing this to highlight this guy, we're playing this package to get this guy on the field. Maybe that means, and I'm a proponent of this, that they go back to a regular old 4-2-5 type of alignment, whether that's a base nickel or a more traditional, not more traditional, but traditional for Notre Dame rover set, and they just get back to playing football. I think that's kind of the biggest thing is, I almost wonder how much of what Notre Dame's defense has struggled with is just being too cute at times. And I don't really have that answer. I don't sit in coaches' meetings, but it just sort of seems like, let's just get back to playing the basics. And I think if you do that and you let guys like Kyle Hamilton and the defensive line and J.D. Bertrand, who's been incredible, in my opinion, filling in for me as Maris Leofau, you let those guys just go play. I think that's the best recipe for Notre Dame on defense, and I'm encouraged by what I heard Brian Kelly say after the Toledo game.
Yeah, I think you just got to let guys play a little bit, and I think that's supposed to be what Marcus Freeman's defense is all about to begin with, is just letting guys play free, letting them play vicious attack-style defense. So that will, kind of lend itself to some big plays here and there, which they've shown. But if it can also lend itself to, 2 or 3 turnovers against teams like Purdue, where they're probably susceptible to turn the ball over against better teams, and then I think the other thing is just rotating guys in, and I think that kind of speaks to a little bit what you said is the more and more you're on the field, if you're playing 70 plus snaps a game, whether you've been terrific like J.D. Bertrand has, just as an example. You're going to get tired, you're going to get gassed, and I think that's where Notre Dame's defense is sort of kind of let up a little bit in the first 2 games. Toledo, they didn't allow a touchdown until the fourth quarter. They had the 1 pick six and a couple field goals. But I was kind of mentioning this on my podcast yesterday. If Notre Dame was up 31-13 or 35-13 or something like that in the fourth quarter without those, without the offense and offensive line kind of playing as poorly as it did, some of those chunk plays no one really talks about. So I really think if Notre Dame can kind of put it together on offense, it's going to lend itself obviously as well to the defense, at least perceivably playing better overall.
I, for one, am disappointed that Xander Horvath is not going to play because for those of you that don't watch Purdue football on a regular basis, not that I do, I try to watch as much football every Saturday as possible, so I know what's going on. But Xander Horvath is certainly a throwback. He's basically a Mike Allstott. He's a thinner version of Mike Allstott. So he's a guy that's just going to wear on the defense. He's just going to wear on the defense. He's not going to do anything special. Not going to make anybody miss necessarily on the second level. But he's going to wear on the defense. He can catch a pass or two out of the backfield. He's got soft hands. So I'll make that comparison to Mike Allstott, and not just because they wore the same uniform in college, but
and he's from Mishawaka too, so right around the Notre Dame area. So that would have been a nice little homecoming for him.
And despite his presence, Purdue has been one of the worst rushing teams in the Big Ten the last couple of years. So he has been the attack. And last week that meant or against Oregon State, not against Connecticut. I'm looking at the Oregon State box score. 81 yards out of their 88 rushing was him on 21 carries. So between a number of players, they are looking for replacements there. And they lean heavily on the pass as it is. I got a question coming in here in the chat. Before we get to that, just want to remind everyone, hit the like button, help us out here on the channel, Voice of College Football, and share these links out on social media, whether that means right this second, let people know that we're talking Notre Dame for about the next half hour or so, and long term, just let people know that we're here talking college football every day. We've got Ben Belden on the line. You can catch his podcast, Under the Dome. And then, of course, Nathan Erbach, he heads up our Notre Dame post-game coverage, which is going to be right here on the main channel and over on the Notre Dame channel that we're building up. Help us get to 1,000 subs on the Notre Dame channel. You can catch Nathan on his podcast, Golden Domers. So before we move on, Golden Homers. That's right. It was the play on Golden Domers. All right, we got you. Golden Homers for Nathan's podcast there. A little baseball, Notre Dame football, of course. And
you search Domers, you might find some other stuff too.
Yeah, I'm thinking. So Ben, what's your podcast all about?
Oh, I generally just focus on Notre Dame. At some point during the basketball season, I hope to talk more Notre Dame basketball on it. But right now, it's pretty exclusively the football team. I took a year off, really, during the pandemic year, and just kind of reset that and trying to revamp it and be more consistent. So,
very good. So we got a comment here in the chat. You guys definitely covered the quarterback situation, but the question coming in here from Gary is basically, what would you do if you're in charge of the quarterback situation? You guys outline what these two guys do well and what they don't do well. And we've got two fairly different players. I don't know that the offense would have to be revamped that much if they went with a younger quarterback. But we'll start with you, Ben, in regards to what would be your decision based on what you've seen of the two.
Well, Cone's 2-0 as a starter. I mean, I'll start there. I mean, I know it wasn't the most pretty 2-0, but can you really hone in on the questions that you have, the issues that Notre Dame has had, and blame it on Jack Cohn? I don't think you can, to be honest with you. And if right now at 2-0 Notre Dame, and I think just about every Notre Dame podcast has put it this way, that all of Notre Dame's goals are still in front of them, and that said, until you've lost a game or two, I think this is Jack Cohn with Tyler Buchner sprinkled in a little bit, because certainly you're going to, try to do what you can to look towards the future. And I think, if you ask anybody from Notre Dame, Tyler Buchner's the future at the quarterback position. So I'm Jack Cohn until he screws it up badly enough that it costs us a game. And I just don't think he's that type of quarterback. He's not going to if Notre Dame loses, you're not going to lose necessarily because of Jack Cohn. So I don't know. That's a roundabout way of saying you stick with Jack Cohn. I think you do look at, Tyler Buchner as a change of pace, but I don't know. I have my apprehensions about a 2-quarterback system, although I sort of weirdly think that in this instance, if there's a time to do it, it would be this one. If it's scripted and makes sense and you ride the hot hand a little bit more. My biggest, as they kind of unveiled this 2-quarterback system kind of by accident on Saturday, my biggest gripe with it always was, Tyler Buchner went out and led a 91-yard drive for a score and then didn't come out the next time. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But so if you find the right way to do it, and I think you've got two guys, in Jack Cohn and Tyler Buchner, who, one is, obviously a very seasoned veteran when it comes to college football. One is, 19 years old. I think they get it. I think they understand where their roles are. So I think it can work, but like I say, Jack Cohn with Tyler Buchner sprinkled in is what I would continue to do, at least until further notice.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard to argue with that. I mean, obviously Jack Cohn is kind of the been there, done that guy. I think he's more talented than people give him credit for. But at the same time, I mean, I've been beating the drum since, like I said, since Buckner was a Notre Dame commit, and this was obviously before they, got Jack Cohn in the transfer portal as well, that I thought Buckner would be ready to go from year one and that they should give him an opportunity. And in reality, I'm just glad that he's getting at least somewhat of an opportunity. And if the offense is going and I think Ben used the right word, scripted. If it's scripted correctly, I think both guys can find success even within the game. I mean, I know the old adage is if you have two quarterbacks, you really have none. But I think in certain circumstances, and I think this one calls for it to an extent, they can be really effective with both because they both bring so many different elements to the game. Obviously, Jack Cohn can force the ball down the field. He's your traditional pocket passer. I think he reads the field pretty well overall, even though, like Ben mentioned earlier, he's kind of locked in on Michael Mayer a few times. But I think overall he's going to make winning plays for you if you give him time to throw the football. And then Buckner's just a really exciting player overall. And while he might not know the Notre Dame offense like the back of his hand yet, I think just with his pure athleticism and his football smarts, like just in general, I think he can make plays even if it is off script in the moment. And so I think I don't know if I would say ride the hot hand yet. I think we're not necessarily there currently, and I don't think Notre Dame was really doing that either. And I think if they rode the hot hand, you'd argue that Buckner would have started the rest of the game after his first few drives. But overall, I mean, I think if you put them both in areas that they can succeed, the offense can do well with both.
I'm starting to feel like myself and the rest of college football nation is getting baited into an incorrect upset pick, because I thought I was ahead of the curve early in the week when I saw this game, and I thought, you know what? I think Purdue might pull off the upset. And now I'm seeing everybody. This seems to be the chic pick of the week. Purdue's going to win this game. And now the more I think about it, the more I think, you know what? Purdue obviously doesn't have a quality win. Oregon State might be the worst team, probably the second worst team in the Pac-12, actually. I don't think anybody can reach Arizona's depths, but they're the second but worst team in the Pac-12. So Purdue's gone out and done what they should do. They've won 2 ball games, and then of course it's more about Notre Dame struggling against one opponent with a big name, obviously, that then laid an egg big time the next week in Jacksonville State, with Florida State losing, and then of course Toledo, a MAC team. Regardless of how good a MAC team, we expect Notre Dame to win those games by 3 or 4 touchdowns. So just the way it's coming together seems like the obvious upset pick to make, where in fact these teams might regress to what they truly are and show that finally here in week 3, and not selling Notre Dame as a great team, but they may show us top 10 to 15 play in the country, and Purdue what they're supposed to be, more like in the top 50 range, and it turns into a 2-touchdown win for Notre Dame.
Yeah, I know me and Ben are obviously both Notre Dame fans, so we're probably a little bit more optimistic when it comes to Notre Dame's play overall. Though you maybe can't say the same about other Notre Dame fans, so maybe I'm lying to myself here. But overall, I mean, I think there's a bigger likelihood that Notre Dame gets back to where they probably should be than an upset happening and Notre Dame continues to struggle. So I tend to lean toward Notre Dame, playing a little bit better on both sides of the ball, and winning and I'm not saying they're going to blow out Purdue. I do think Purdue is actually a pretty talented team. I mean, top 50 team isn't a slouch by any means. But I tend to think it's going to be a 2-score game if Notre Dame, plays to their usual abilities.
Purdue came into the season being projected as basically about a 3-6 team in the Big Ten. And a 5-7 or 6-6 team overall. D-Rock Irish. Now this is case in point right here. He's playing right into it. Upset game of the week, and I don't think I need to sell his allegiance. I think it's pretty much on his sleeve. is seeing Purdue winning this game 31-28. I'm expecting you guys probably have your predictions elsewhere, and if you want to save those for elsewhere, otherwise you can certainly make them here.
Yeah, well, to just weigh in, I guess, on this part. I think what Nathan just said kind of hit the nail on the head. I'd be way more surprised, honestly, if Notre Dame turns out it being at least pretty good than just real bad, I guess. If you're taking, if you're making bets, what are they closer to? I think it's closer to really pretty good than really pretty bad. I'll also say this, that I really think that people are underestimating, and Nathan kind of referenced this earlier too, what the hangover from Florida State in this Toledo game. I mean, Notre Dame gets back to South Bend at 4 a.m. on Monday, and it just pushes their whole body clock, time clock. Their preparation maybe wasn't the best. I don't know, but you can make all the theories you want, but I really think that had something to do with it. Certainly the issues are still there. I mean, regardless of if they were well rested or not, the offensive line still has its issues. Now, are they as bad? I don't know. I don't know. So I think the first time that we really get to see Notre Dame, in a typical circumstance, I guess, is Saturday. And I expect it to work out better for Notre Dame because some of those things, the first home game after COVID, are out of the way. The shortened week after the Sunday night game, out of the way. So they've kind of survived some of that stuff that isn't quite so typical. And, I think that's going to play to their favor as well.
And not only is it their first normal week, but it's also back-to-back weeks at home, which makes it even more normal. There's no travel. I know Purdue obviously wouldn't be you wouldn't be traveling across country or anything like that. But I do think that helps kind of being, and I think I've already heard that it's pretty much a sold out crowd, unlike the Toledo game, even though, and Ben can probably reference this, I think it probably seemed more like a sold out crowd based on the atmosphere. It was actually a pretty electric atmosphere from what I was able to kind of hear on my own, and then what I was kind of able to put together based on other people that were there. But to answer your question, Mark, I actually made my prediction on my podcast yesterday, so obviously feel free to listen to it there. But I mentioned it was going to – I kind of pictured it around 37-23. Not necessarily the prettiest game overall, but I think it will be better than it has been. I don't think it's going to be one of those things that comes down to the wire where Notre Dame's going to either have to make a score or make a stop. If anything, I might even see it more on the lines of Purdue kind of gets themselves back into it with a late score, and it looks better than it was. But no, 37-23 is my final score, and I think the defense and the offense play a little bit more to their abilities overall.
Well, there's somebody here who predicted Notre Dame to make the college football playoff. So since all my stuff is out there for everyone to see, I'm not going to run from that prediction. I will disclaim it because people were shocked when I made it that so when you announce you've got a prediction show and there's going to be, a couple hundred people that are going to show up live, and then you don't take the preparation time that you probably should in leading up to it, and you're still kind of scrambling like 5 minutes before trying to figure out what you're actually going to predict. And the way I laid out the conference championship games, I thought, my goodness, I got a log jam here. Oh, what's Notre Dame going to do? I haven't really looked at, and I just figured, and certainly they haven't looked like a playoff team the first 2 weeks. So I'm not feeling extremely confident. And even when I made the prediction, but I looked at that schedule and I thought, I think that they're going to lose a game to fill in the blank: Wisconsin, USC, North Carolina. Am I missing somebody there? Sure. Somebody like a Virginia could be capable on a given day, but in terms of a prime candidate to lose to, it's Wisconsin, North Carolina, USC, right? I'm not looking at the schedule right now, but there might have been one other team in there.
Cincinnati. I don't know if you mentioned
Cincinnati. Oh, bingo. There you go. Cincinnati.
It's probably the best team on their schedule, to be completely honest at this point.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, Cincinnati or Wisconsin. Certainly USC. You look at them a little different right now than you did 10 days ago, after they couldn't even, my goodness, they were down 4 scores to Stanford. That was the shock of the week for me.
And then North
Yeah.
Carolina didn't look too good against Virginia Tech, who I think might actually be a pretty good football team, but Notre Dame plays them as well. I mean, I think if everything kind of stays the way it is right now, I forget if USC fell out of the polls or not after their loss.
I would hope so.
But if they did not, I didn't have a chance to look at them. They had
I think so.
Yeah. So I originally going into the last week, they had a stretch of 5 games in a row against ranked teams because Virginia Tech had jumped into the polls after their win against North Carolina. But I doubt all 5 teams are ranked when they play them.
Absolutely. All right. We got Ben Belden on the line, also Nathan Urbach, who heads up our post-game coverage on Notre Dame football. And you can catch this week's version after the Purdue game right here on the main channel, also on the Notre Dame channel. And actually this simulcast is going out on both as well. You can catch Ben on Under the Dome, Nathan on, I have to correct him on this all the time, Golden Homers. It's Golden Homers, Nathan's podcast, of course. All right, catch both of them. They've supplied their knowledge on Notre Dame football for me on a number of occasions through the years. So, is there any other spot in this football team that you guys are surprised? Not necessarily. We've been pretty critical, and for good reason. 2 close wins against marginal teams. That would be what you would expect of a Notre Dame analysis at this point. But anything that stands out or is a surprise in regards to whether that's an individual player or how they're approaching offense? Of course, you guys are seeing the defense under Marcus Freeman for the first time. And Nathan, in setting up the conversation in the offseason, the way I remember you laying it out there is that Clark Lee certainly got this defense in a great position from the standpoint of technique, fundamentals, being in the right place, doing the right thing. But from a scheme standpoint, that Marcus Freeman might be the guy to draw up some things that are a little bit more creative and speak, to the offensive game plan and may attack an offense a little bit better.
Go ahead, Ben.
I think the pleasant surprise, I guess, for me is J.D. Bertrand. I mentioned him earlier in the show. I mean, he was the second-string linebacker before Notre Dame lost Maris Leofau the week the season was starting. If Maris Leofau is healthy right now, then J.D. Bertrand is still the second linebacker, but he's looked like one of Notre Dame's better players on the defense. And I'll also just sort of say that, Notre Dame's, and nobody's surprised necessarily about Notre Dame's defensive line, but to highlight I think have played well. And if there's one thing I always mess up, it's which Ademilola twin plays inside and which one plays outside. But both of them, Jason and Justin, have been, very good. Nathan can help me out with this. The one that plays inside, I thought has been terrific as he's been in there. So. Yeah, so Jason, number 57, plays the defensive tackle position, and I've as I've watched the defensive line, he seems to be a guy that every time I kind of hone in on him, I like what I see. And, Justin from the outside got a sack last week at a critical moment. And so, I've just been, we knew Notre Dame's defensive line was good. I always harp on depth, and I've seen a lot of really good, I would say Notre Dame has 10 to 12 defensive line players that, you can play pretty much all the time. Isaiah Foskey is even better than I thought he was, to just mention another name. And I knew he was going to be pretty good. So those are my pleasant surprises, I guess you could kind of say, or at least something that I, maybe had a hunch about that I still now feel pretty good about.
Yeah, I mean, Jason Ademilola specifically, I wouldn't say I'm surprised with how he's playing overall. I mean, he's always been a guy that when he's gotten onto the field, he's been disruptive. But he was never a starter. With the new Marcus Freeman defense, MTA or Myron Tagovailoa has moved outside to the strong side defensive end, and Jason Ademilola has kind of taken over the three technique spot. But with him playing bigger, I wanted to say bigger minutes, like this was a basketball game, but just him playing more snaps. It's nice to see that he has been able to keep up that level of play that he showed kind of in spurts, specifically last season. And in reality, I think he's a guy that's really showcasing himself for the NFL, and someone that might even be a first, early second round pick, possibly even as early as this year. Ben mentioned Isaiah Foskey. I mean, he was a guy that kind of the same thing. I mean, they had, Adio Gandeji and Dalen Hayes last year that were, their main defensive ends. Justin Adamalola played defensive end a little bit last year as well. And Isaiah Foskey kind of came in spurts, sort of like Jason Adamalola, and really showed off his pass rushing abilities. But now as kind of the main Viper for them, I think he has 3 sacks in 2 games. He's another guy. I think he made the freak list on the Athletic that Bruce Feldman does every year. I think it's Bruce Feldman if I have that correct. And he's a guy that's really showing off those traits so far this season in a big way. So those are kind of, I guess, 2 surprises in the sense that with bigger minutes or bigger, or bigger snap counts or more snap counts, they've kind of stayed the way they were. But for me, the biggest surprise has kind of been the cornerback position. Coming into this season, that was meant to be a weakness for this year's team, and haven't necessarily been targeted too much because the rushing attack for both Toledo and Florida State was able to kind of do what they needed to do at times. But I think Clarence Lewis and Cam Hart have played well when they've been targeted. And I think a lot of people going into the year thought that would be probably the biggest weakness on Notre Dame's defense.
Couple things from social media. One of you brought up what John Feinstein said. So if you can reiterate that. And also I saw on social media that maybe the Boilers are going to be a little bit upset. They can't bring their drum or something.
Yeah, it's been the talk of the day.
You don't want to get what's the guy's name? The guy with the big hat, the hard hat, Pete the Boiler, whatever they call him. You don't want to get him mad at you. So what's this all about?
I think the biggest thing is I mean, obviously Purdue, I think, has one of the better bands in the country, and they have this, this famous big drum that they bring to every game. And Notre Dame, since the last time they played them, has done some renovations in the, in the stadium, and it no longer fits in the visiting, clubhouse or the walkway leading out to the stadium. And Notre Dame essentially said, well, you're not going to come in our area to get it through. And I have a feeling that's going to change with the way that it's sort of been, advertised so far on social media. I'm thinking Notre Dame will eventually allow it, but we only have a couple more days, I suppose. But in regarding the John Feinstein tweet, we don't have to dive too much into this because it was sort of dumb overall. But I think the biggest issue with it is he said that Notre Dame shouldn't be ranked 12th because they allowed, the only reason they beat Toledo was because of 2 pass interference calls. And my response was, well, first of all, if you're getting pass interference calls and they're blatant, then what's the issue? You're probably out-athleting the team that's against you. And then second, one of them wasn't even a pass interference because Kevin Austin made a terrific catch. So it would have negated the pass interference anyway. And honestly, almost losing to Toledo was all he had to say to begin with, because I think most Notre Dame fans weren't expecting it to be that close.
Was he basically saying that the pass interference calls were poor calls, or just that Notre Dame won because of the?
I think he was saying they needed the calls to win, but and specifically because both of them were on the last drive when Jack Cohn let him down for the touchdown to win the game. But like I mentioned, like one of them was a terrific catch anyway for like 40 yards, and then the other one, Michael Mayer, who he always targets, of course, was literally tackled.
Yeah, and as if Toledo got no calls throughout the game too. I mean, that's my add-on to the conversation. I mean, I was mad at a few pass interference calls, particularly one in the end zone that I think was on 3rd down, if I remember correctly. Let Toledo eventually then score a touchdown there. So I don't know, dumb. Move on.
Folks, we always appreciate the conversation from everybody coming in here, leaving your comments, your questions. Got Nathan Urbach on the line, also Ben Belden. They've got their respective Notre Dame podcasts, so please check out Nathan at Golden Homers and also Ben at Under the Dome. And I think that should wrap it up unless you guys have anything else for us.
I'm good, Mark.
All right, good stuff. Again, Notre Dame post game right here on the main channel, also on the Notre Dame channel. So we've got a Notre Dame channel. Want people to go over there and subscribe. Get us up to 1,000 subs would be phenomenal. Right here at the Voice of College Football. I am off to talk a little Auburn, a little Penn State tonight. Those will not be live streams. Those are records, so be looking out for those videos coming out soon. Nathan, Ben, good to see you guys. Appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.